Alice Corbin Henderson did not want to leave Chicago. The Midwest born and raised poet and editor had everything that she needed right there in the city. She was in with the hot and happening poets of the day. She was the co-editor of the most popular and influential of the city's poetry magazines, and she was receiving considerable acclaim as a rising poet herself. When her husband told her that he was moving the family to Sante Fe, she felt that her world was ending. Yet, it didn't end, even if it did almost kill her. She moved to New Mexico in 1916 and found something there that she never could have imagined: a muse. Her entire worldview shifted, gazing upon the vistas of pueblos and cacti, and she quickly became one of the most prominent advocates for Midwest poetry and indigenous Midwestern culture. The move proved not to be a career ender, but a catalyst for her most prolific and meaningful era as an artist. Henderson kept editing her Chicago-based periodical remotely, and her newfound Midwestern influence would come to heavily shape national poetry taste. This change made her grapple with her own relationship with place, and with the notion that real art could only happen in the cities, and that real poets were only an urban commodity. Living out in New Mexico, she found a true appreciation for the rural, for the small town, for the outskirts of American civilization. She realized that her move had forever changed not only her poetic sensibilities, but her outlook on life. Rachel Williamson is a graduate student here at UNCW, and her thesis is dedicated to Alice Corbin Henderson's career and poetry. In her own writing, she analyzes the changes that Henderson underwent and considers the widespread effects that her writing had on American poetry. In doing so, she asks us all to consider the effect that place has on our day-to-day lives. She encourages us to wonder, is true art only made in the cities? What is the value of a life on the outskirts? For a small coastal town with its own vibrant community of poets, songwriters, and artists, I feel that Wilmington is exactly the kind of city that needs to hear a message like Henderson's. It's a message of hope, of creation, of finding peace and community right here, right where you already are. From Audacious Media and the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, you're listening to the Relevate Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Charles Wright. Let's begin, shall we? Rachel, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
What originally drew you to start researching Alice Corbin Henderson?
I was in Dr. Porco's 513 class in spring of 2023, and it was based around little magazines. So we were studying modernism through the context of little magazines, one of the first of which was Poetry magazine that Alice Corbin Henderson was an editor of. So that's how I heard of her first. And we had to do a roundtable discussion project. And I ended up, throughout this semester, I had been interested in her and had kind of looked up her poetry. She wasn't primarily known as a poet, she was known as an editor, but I was kind of drawn to some of her poems. And then as I looked more into her life and found out that she moved to Sante Fe, I just became more interested in her, partly because I am very interested in the American West, and I haven't spent a lot of time there, so I can't really say exactly why, but I had been reading like Edward Abbey and Wallace Stegner and some people who are Western writers and talking about the making of the myth of the American West and the landscape out there and just how impactful it is. So yeah, I was just interested to see what her take on that was.
What was it about her story that compelled you to dedicate your thesis to her work and her influence on modernist poetry?
I was very interested to hear that she did a lot of her editorial work for Poetry Chicago from Sante Fe. So when I looked a little bit more into her life and found out that she was so far from Chicago, I was interested at first in figuring out, like, okay, what was the relationship like between her and Harriet Monroe, the main editor at Poetry Chicago? And especially, she was a mediator between Monroe and Ezra Pound, who was a very controversial figure. Both of them were honestly controversial figures. But in reading about her, I found that she did a great job of kind of bringing the two together. She had a lot of correspondence with both of them. So when I started the project, I was like, maybe I want to look into that. Maybe I want to look into what it was like to be an editor so far away at that time with correspondence and all of that.
Yeah, when I was reading the material that you sent over to me, that was something that really surprised me, especially thinking that this was the 19-teens. Like, this was such a long time. It was over 100 years ago. And to be able to edit a magazine in Chicago remotely from Sante Fe at the beginning of the 20th century is like, how did she even do that?
Yes. Yeah, I know. That was kind of one of the angles I was thinking about taking is physical letters. What was that like? I just sadly don't know a lot about how correspondence, how quick it went back then. It seems like it was pretty quick from what I saw in her archives and everything. That's embarrassing that I don't know that much about like mail correspondence, but I was going to see, just what her experience was editing from afar. But then
and that's also not your fault, because who knows what was lost. I mean, it's been a long time and not everything was archived.
Right. I think that was one of the angles I was interested in, but just the amount of connections that she had, and she was very close with a lot of people who had very different styles and opinions and circles. So I found that to be a cool characteristic of hers.
You open your thesis by addressing a question that Henderson was chiefly fascinated with throughout her career, especially from when she moved to Sante Fe, which is the question that, and this is a quote, "Must one live in New York?" And this question, I think, has two connotations. On one hand, there's the notion that creative people have to move to an artistic hub like New York, Paris, or London to ever have a chance of, quote unquote, making it in their career. But then on the other hand, there's also this belief that artists who do not move to these centers inherently lack an artistic authority somehow, that they can never be considered real artists, and that only real art can happen in the cities. What I find fascinating about this is that she's grappling with this idea way back in the beginning of the 20th century. And here we are, like I've said, we're 100 years later. And that idea hasn't really gone away. It's still the idea that if you're an actor, you have to go to New York if you want to make it on the stage, or London. And if you want to be a screen actor, you have to go to Los Angeles. So the notion is still largely intact. What did Alice Corbin Henderson say about this belief that real creative success could only be had in big cultural hubs?
Well, first, this was a article that I found in her archives, and it's unpublished. So it was just interesting. It's very fully fleshed out, but I don't think she ever published it anywhere, at least that I could find. And I was very excited to find it because I attended college in New York, and I loved the city. But I did decide to come back to North Carolina, and I think it's a question that I think about all the time. It's like, do you have to live in New York if you want to be an artist, if you want to interact with these artistic ideas that are out there? And what I love about her essay is how even-handed she is. She definitely takes a strong stance in the sense that she is advocating for local communities and local artists, saying it's unfortunate that people do feel that they have to leave because either they think they can't get the right training or they aren't properly appreciated in their hometowns. So she's saying that, but she's also saying that she understands why people do leave to go to the cities, and she understands why places like New York or Chicago or London are so exciting, and even envisions herself. She says at the end of the essay, maybe I'll end up moving there too. But for now, I'm okay to live in obscurity and to kind of relish in the uniqueness of the artistic community that I have found myself in. So I appreciate her consistent even-handedness.
Yeah, that is very interesting. It's an interesting take, and one that I agree with as somebody who works in creative spaces and lives not in New York City. And there's also, especially nowadays, and it was probably still very similar 100 years ago. There's the trope of the starving artist, sort of, I would think, comes out of spaces like that, where when you live in a cultural hub, it's the most expensive places in the world to live. So if you want to just go and be an artist, be a poet, be a writer, you're moving there to live in squalor until you make it.
Yes, because you're not going to get paid if you're an artist. It's like T.S. Eliot working for a bank, I think it was at one point, and he completely stopped writing, but he was fed up with being super poor. So and then
as opposed to living somewhere where you can actually afford to live, and then because of that afford to make better art because you have more time.
Exactly. Yeah, you're surrounded by less culture, I guess, but you have more time to actually make culture. So
exactly.
Catch-22 a bit.
How do you think that the internet has changed the reality of this question? Do you think that it's been an equalizer? Has it made things harder? Has it shifted our cultural relationship to art and audience?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Definitely has shifted things, I think, and I'm sure that we have no idea how much it has yet. But I think in one sense, it obviously connects us to each other. So somebody who's living in New York might find an artist in Nebraska that they love and buy their work or share it. So in that sense, it kind of equalizes between rural and city. At the same time, I think it can have a bit of a negative effect that it does homogenize the way we're all consuming the same things. So if we're all taking in roughly the same content, then we're going to probably output roughly the same content. So I think what Corbin Henderson was advocating for is how unique Sante Fe's artistic culture was because it was separated from New York, because it wasn't, you weren't kind of being pushed into this center where you all kind of melt together. I don't think that that's necessarily always true for people that move to the city, just to clarify. I think that you can still retain a sense of unique identity there. But with social media particularly, I think it is easy for everybody to kind of start blending into the same thing.
Yeah. I've talked about this on this podcast before with the sort of the explosion of the internet and the way that it has completely changed the way art is both made and consumed.
Yeah.
And I was talking to Aiden Healy, who's an undergraduate student. He's graduating this semester. But we were talking about streaming and talking about like videos or movies and television shows, and how with streaming, it's sort of the same thing with the internet, because the streaming is the internet, where you have this explosion of content because there's now so many platforms for people to create their art, create the movies and television shows that they want to make. But then there's also this strange effect where now there's too much and you can't actually consume all of it. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of the same thing with artists, where now, before, if you wanted to find an artist, you had to go to a local gallery, you had to go somewhere, like you had to go to a place where
there's
the artists were.
There's a finite amount of things.
Yeah, there was a finite amount of avenues for an artist to get their stuff seen. And now anybody with a phone can be an artist on Instagram, and you can find them. There's millions of people trying to make it as artists, and there always were millions of people trying to make it as artists. But now, the sheer ocean of content and creativity on the internet, it's overwhelming. It's interesting. It's that like give and take. We're like, okay, well, this is a positive thing, but it's also a negative thing at the same time. It's just different. Yeah.
Not to sidebar too much, but I feel like that's part of the reason for our generation's crippling anxiety is just the amount of information out there, the amount of options, the amount of people you're competing against for any given job. Since so many jobs are remote now, thousands of people are applying from all over the country for one position. Yep. So just things like that. It's on social media, you're competing against other artists. Yeah, I think that it will be something we have to figure out how to work through.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's get back to the paper. Tell me about Henderson's journey to Sante Fe and the impact that her experience had on her career in poetry.
Yes, so she was, like I said, in Chicago, kind of, I think at the time that she moved, she was 31 or so, and she was in the center of things, thriving at Poetry Magazine, touching base with some of the most well-known and exciting new poetry of the time, and then she got tuberculosis. So her mom had died of tuberculosis when she was 4, and since that time, in between when she was 4 and when she moved to Sante Fe, she had moved out of Chicago before to avoid contracting the disease. So that's just like a cultural context thing, that it was very on the mind for a lot of people, and a lot of people were moving out of the city to avoid getting it, or because they had gotten it. Anyways, she did end up getting tuberculosis, and her doctors basically said that she was probably going to die. And so they sent her to Sun Mountain Sanatorium in New Mexico, and that was a kind of a common course of treatment for people at the time. So her family, she and her husband, who was an artist and architect in Chicago, and then their daughter, little Alice, they all moved to Sun Mountain. And then she ended up kind of recovering, moved to Sante Fe, and lived there for the rest of her life. So she kept working with poetry and working with Harriet Monroe until she moved there in 1916, and then she was still editor until 1922, and then she resigned. And there she had a bit of a falling out with Harriet Monroe that I don't honestly know all the details of, but she stepped away from poetry and then started doing other stuff more based in Sante Fe. But it definitely impacted the character of the magazine. Even before she moved, she was super interested in folklore, folk poetry, and also advocating for American poets. Harriet Monroe had her own project going on that was nationalist, and she kind of wanted to build a national American literature. So Alice Corbin Henderson was working under that. So
your two narratives there are beginning to explain where the falling out could have occurred.
Exactly.
Very different visions.
Yes, yeah. And I think that Alice Corbin did align with Harriet Monroe in a lot of ways on that. So that was one of the complexities of writing my thesis, is how to balance. Like, I think that Alice Corbin Henderson agreed with Harriet Monroe to an extent, about wanting to create a national identity of American literature at this time in American history. But at the same time, as she moved to Santa Fe, I think she increasingly grew a little more nuanced in her position and kind of separated herself from that mission a little bit. She was advocating for American literature, but kind of without the nationalist element, I think. She was more looking at like transnational literature and how lots of different cultures converged in that specific region to create kind of its own sort of thing that was like local, regional, national, transnational all at the same time. But she definitely included a lot of the poets that she worked with in Santa Fe in the magazine for those years. So it's interesting, like cowboy poets would be right next to Ezra Pound's cantos, and they're extremely different. So I like that juxtaposition.
Yeah, I feel like that really shows, I like that too. It shows the, we call America the melting pot, but then to try to melt everything down into being one homogenous goo, it just takes the character out of everything, where instead you, like a poetry magazine like that can really articulate the different flavors of American poetry is really, it's more interesting. Having dynamic content is way more interesting than having everything look and sound exactly the same.
Yeah, I think that she grapples with the question of how much do things in America melt together and how much do they retain their own distinct sort of cultural identity. And it's a very complicated question that we're obviously still wrestling with today in a lot of places. But yeah, it's very interesting to think about how they engage with each other and how they interact with each other. Yeah.
Despite being vehemently against her family's move to New Mexico, even though she had tuberculosis, Henderson really fell in love with the area during her first few months there. What was it that inspired her change of heart?
I think almost immediately after she was writing to people, her friends in the city, and talking about the landscape and the artistic endeavors that were already going on there, particularly the Native American dances. She wrote about those pretty frequently. And she just, at the end of her life, she just said that they fell in love with the art community and the environment. At first, it was a little hard for me to determine, was she seeing it from this lens because she wanted to promote it to her community back in Chicago in a certain light to make herself feel like, oh, I'm still connected to art. Like, don't worry about me. I'm good down here. But I think that she really did grow a genuine appreciation for people. She had this kind of stereotyped view of it before she left, that it was going to be just a wasteland of just dead land, dead culture. But she was proven very wrong, and I think that she felt she wanted to share that with the people that she had left behind. So
that's very cool. Yeah, that journey of realization is very interesting, because I think that it's one that probably a lot of people that would have done traveling in that time period would have experienced, because of what we were talking about, the nationalist narrative and the American narrative that civilization only goes so far. Like you have the East Coast, and then it gets a little bit, you still have civilization as it goes into the Midwest, but once you go further, once you go out towards the West Coast, you're like, well, those are all just barren lands. It's like, well, no, there's lots of indigenous people that live there, and there's tons of culture. Yeah, you're just blind to it because you don't want it to exist.
Yeah, she even uses that phrase of it's so almost so familiar in some ways that we're blind to it. And specifically talking about Native American culture, how she argues that it's steeped into the way that all artists who are in America create art. And she wanted to show that influence and show people that they're being impacted by that.
In the poetry class that we're in, the Black Mountain class, we talked about how a number of the Black Mountain poets, and this is decades after Henderson, but they would go down to Mexico or down to South America and have these like incredible experiences with indigenous art down there. And every time we talked about that, I thought it was like a little funny, because as if the United States of America doesn't have its own indigenous cultures and indigenous art. It's like, they didn't have to go that far.
Right. I know. Yeah. Unfortunately, they were being rapidly stamped out in America by just, as we know. She talks about the differences between California and Santa Fe, how indigenous culture in Santa Fe, or even just like Native American and Spanish and cowboy, all of those cultures had been rapidly commercialized in California, but she felt like in Santa Fe, it wasn't that way yet. It definitely became that way while she was living there.
As part of your research, the grad school paid for you to travel to the University of Texas, Austin to explore Henderson's archives. What was that experience like?
It was incredible. It was one of the best experiences that I've had in academics up to this point, and definitely one of the best in grad school. Basically, they funded my flight, and I got to go stay near the campus, which was really nice to just walk there. And I had kind of 2 full days in the archives at the Harry Ransom Center. They have tons of archival material there. It's a huge center. I know other people in the grad school in the English department have gone there as well to look at other people's stuff. And there's a little bit of an intense check-in process when you get there, but when you get in, they give you the keys to, not the keys, but they give you access to boxes and they pull them out. And she had a lot of boxes. I don't remember exactly how many, but there was tons of stuff to go through. I feel like I barely scratched the surface, but I had narrowed it down to kind of the years 1916 to 1928 and worked through those. I mean, I just loved like reading her letters and seeing pictures that she had taken or sent, reading some of her essays, her notes. I think my favorite part was probably reading her unpublished notes that she was jotting to see her thought processes and what she was interested in. I think working with the old material was so fun, and it was nice to know there was a finite amount of stuff to look through. Even though I didn't have time to look through all of it, it wasn't like researching on the internet where I feel like I have no idea what stuff I'm missing because
it's endless.
Yeah, it's so stressful. But looking at archives, I was like, okay, if I had enough time, I could look through all of it. I don't, but for some reason that was comforting to me. But at the end, I was like taking pictures rapidly of things because I didn't have enough time. So yeah.
That's cool. How long was your How long were you in the archives?
I went, I'm trying to remember, the 2 days that I was there, kind of for the full days, I would go in the morning and then take a break and then go back for the afternoon. So I was there for like 8 hours, nice. Mostly for like those 2 days. And then I went back for a couple hours the morning before my flight. And I think the first day I was lollygagging a little bit because I was just kind of getting lost in the archives. So the second day I had to make a plan.
What did you glean from going through her physical collection that you never could have from simply researching online or in books?
A lot of the stuff that I used as evidence was from the archives, which was really fun. I think especially her arguments about the formation of American literature and how folk poetry shapes the character of literature in America and elsewhere, and just her ideas about how to engage with art that feels foreign and also art that feels incredibly familiar. So kind of like defamiliarizing art that feels super familiar and making art that feels very strange, like absorbing it. You kind of get into some complicated areas there with like appropriation and co-opting that there are definitely concerns about and other scholars have talked about, but I feel like she was really grappling with and trying to work through how to appropriately engage with her art community in Santa Fe, and a lot of her writings in the archives addressed that, and I saw where her mind was going with that, which was cool.
Did anything in your research surprise you while you were conducting it?
Yes, I think I was super surprised by just how large of a network she had, and I had gotten a hint of that through my digital research. But it was just fun to see. For example, she had a letter that she had corresponded some with Robert Frost. And
wow, that's cool.
Which was fun to see his letters. And he had just written to her at different points, and it kind of closer to the end of her career, he was just like, I've just loved being poets with you and our time together. And I don't think that that's really a narrative about her that is put out there a lot, that, oh, she's a poet with Robert Frost and all these other people. She was kind of just really seen as an editor and really talked about only in the context of Harriet Monroe. Then she also has this incredible amount of correspondence with Ezra Pound, who's completely opposite end of the spectrum from Robert Frost. They had a super strong relationship, and he really respected her editorial advice. So just the way she was able to adjust to her different audiences in her letters and build those relationships, I really saw that in the archives.
How did your research question or your research focus shift over the course of your project? Is the paper that you set out to write different than the one that you have now?
Yes, 100%. I think one of the biggest things I had to deal with was the fact that I was talking about an anthology for most of my paper, The Turquoise Trail, and she includes very disparate poets in that because it's place-based. So she designed it to be artists who were interacting with Sante Fe kind of for the first time. There's a couple people that grew up around there, but most of the people were experiencing it for the first time and writing poetry about it. And there are super traditional poems in there that have a strong rhyme scheme, more folk songs, cowboy poetry that are kind of songs that you sing on the prairie or whatever it may be. And then there's also really super inventive free verse, imagism, that type of thing in there. So the struggle with writing about that was figuring out I couldn't write about all of it. Like I could not write about all of the poets and all of the poems. So I just had to choose a direction. And I ended up focusing on one poet, Marston Hartley. And that was a big shift. But it was super exciting. That was one of my favorite parts of the project. It ended up being. That was a big shift for sure.
That's cool. Yeah, I like to ask everybody that question when they come on because I feel that, especially undergraduates who hopefully are listening to this, you often will approach a paper with an idea of what you're going to write about. And then through the research process, you then find that your original point isn't true or isn't quite, isn't as substantial as you thought that it was. And then you get frustrated because you have to change your whole research question or your research focus. And I've had this experience before where I set out to write one thing and then quickly you do research and you're like, oh, I was wrong.
Can't find evidence to support my point.
And I want people to know that everybody feels this way and that it's super normal to have to completely shift the focus of your paper halfway through.
Yeah, that is, I was talking about this the other day and we were just saying how we'll write something and at the end of the paper, that will be the part that's the part of the paper. Yep. And I think with this project, I often found that I would write and then figure out what I was saying at the end and then recenter that.
How has your research influenced the way that you view literature, art, and the world around you? Because I feel like Henderson goes through a real shift in how she views poetry and place and the world around her. And I was wondering how reading all of that, how that affected you.
It had a huge effect. I think that the poetry class in general where I started the project hugely affected how I viewed literature, especially poetry. I don't know about you, but I took one poetry course in undergrad, and it was a survey of English and American poetry. So we read everything from Canterbury Tales all the way to Seamus Heaney, who was 20th century. Yeah. And it was a lot to take in, and I enjoyed it, but I did not understand the connections between the poets and how they're building on each other or responding to each other. I think that this project and that poetry class really made me think about how poets were writing things that were connected to each other. They were all shaping literary history together. I feel like just knowing, I've never really even thought about all the correspondence that would go on between these artists. In previous years, I just thought about them as poets that worked by themselves and they published these poems and maybe occasionally talked to each other, but really their interactions with each other shaped all of their art. So it's definitely changed how I study literature in that way.
Yeah, it is really interesting to, when you study something more and more, realize the relationships that different artists have with each other and how it's really interesting to how those artists' relationships influenced very broadly the tastes of a certain genre in America. At a certain time, a lot of filmmakers in Hollywood were all just really good friends, and they were all, and then they established what was cinema taste all over the whole world. It's really it's fascinating to see how such a small group of people can have such a huge influence. It's
definitely been interesting to understand and grapple with, for better or for worse. People really control the narrative in a lot of ways, and partially because people who write more or they were very prolific, they just kind of had that power. But there are some people who didn't have. I think even in thinking about Native American cultures that weren't even using written language a lot, what that meant for them, their culture lasting, and grappling with that too, how they don't have archives necessarily maybe to look through as much, but they still have culture that needs to be understood and learned about. So it's interesting.
Did your research lead you to any major conclusions?
Yeah, I'm still working through the exact conclusions, but I think that one of the biggest ones has to do, I think what she was advocating for were, first, the thriving artistic communities outside of urban centers. So that was something. Then second, how different influences shape literary development, like folk for her specifically, Spanish American culture, Native American culture, and cowboy culture, how those were, they're kind of, at least with cowboy poetry and folk poetry, I think it was thought of as like pop, like today's pop stuff. And it's kind of just seen, especially by more, maybe people who have more, I'm trying to think of the term, like people who are really invested in like literature and people with English degrees and all of that. They're like, oh, pop stuff. I'm not sure about it. But that stuff really does shape, no matter what, if you're engaging with it and you're surrounded by it, it's going to shape the way that art is formed in your country or environment or whatever it may be. I feel like even back then she was thinking about how to reframe folk content as not this thing to be looked down upon, but as a thing to be appreciated and understood. So that was one of the biggest things.
Yeah, I have talked one-on-one with Dr. Porco about this, just the problem with genreification of things. Like something gets lumped in with a genre, and then suddenly it has all of these other connotations attached to it. And a lot of times those connotations aren't true, but they're stuck with it, and it can discredit the art, or it can unnecessarily elevate the art. It's interesting, that relationship that we have with, as a culture, we just love to put a genre on things because we like to put things in boxes and then 100%. Feel that we understand them without actually engaging with them. And that you're speaking right to that same sentiment. Yeah.
One of the biggest influences on my research was Jahan Ramazani, who is a scholar that talks about transnational poetry and poetry defying genres. And I think his most recent book was called Poetry and Its Others. And it's talking about poetry's connection to news and song and prayer and other things. I think that is a lot of the stuff that Alice Corbin Henderson was getting at too, with poetry, not being so strictly defined. And she wasn't maybe doing it in as radical of a way as other people were, but she was doing it in some ways. It was kind of radical to be a modernist that was really engaging closely with folk poetry in that way, and being willing to bend genres in an anthology like the Turquoise Trail that completely defied all genre.
Why do you think that this kind of research is essential?
Like we've talked about, Alice Corbin Henderson, she's not really talked about a lot in terms of the modernist conversation in general. And when she's talked more so in context of her relationship to Harriet Monroe or Ezra Pound. And especially after her move to Sante Fe, there's not a lot of scholarship about that. And I think it's partially because we still center the study of modernism around the centers like Chicago, London, New York, Berlin. And there's valid reasons for the narratives that exist, but there's also valid reasons to expand the narratives and to look outside of those centers and to see what was going on at other times, and where modernists who weren't living in those city centers, what they were doing. So I think part of the reason it is essential to do research like this is to just have a more complete story, to really show what was going on at the time. And if we're going to talk about American literature and we're going to talk about Harriet Monroe's project to form a national literature, or if we're going to use the term American literature or British literature, it's important to talk about what were people saying about the idea of literature defined by countries and boundaries. And Alice Corbin Henderson was definitely doing that. And I don't think that aspect of her work is being talked about a lot.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. That's sort of what we do here in the English department, is elaborate on what was the full story to the best of our abilities. And it is very important, because otherwise we just have one narrative.
Right. Yeah. And with the knowledge that there's different narratives of her life too, like the scholarship that I read is different from what I wrote. And I would be remiss to say that I had a completely unbiased perspective, but I think that it's just important to have all those perspectives and know that whatever angle you're looking at, it's going to be an angle, but that's okay. Let's just get it from as many angles as possible.
What led you to pursue a degree in the humanities in the first place?
I have always loved, I think like most English majors, love to read and loved the arts. I actually went into college as a politics, philosophy, and economics major.
Really?
Yeah. So that shifted shortly into my time in college. My school had a program called Media, Culture, and the Arts, and I really just fell in love with those courses. I just really was drawn back into that realm, so I ended up majoring in that Media, Culture, and the Arts and minoring in literature. Then I think I grew. There's definitely been times throughout my academic career where I've wrestled with my choice to study humanities. Yeah. Sometimes I've been so passionate about it and really just know that literature opens us up so much to each other and to being, it can shape us into people. And also literary history is history, art history is history, and those histories are just as important to know as history of World War I, World War II, and all of that. They're all, I feel like they're sometimes siloed, but in the term humanities kind of brings them all together.
What gives you hope right now for the future of the humanities?
I think the people in this cohort give me a lot of hope. I have been super inspired and encouraged by the seriousness with which people in the program like approach their studies and the excitement for it. I also think that even though it doesn't seem very hopeful, and there's an article every other day about the dying English department, I think that in some ways that's what English is. It's not going to be the moneymaker, and it's not going to be the biggest major for a long time, at least. I think that kind of makes it more true to what it should be. It should be studied as something that's not just has utilitarian value, because I feel like that kind of takes away the point of it. I feel like even though we do talk about all the things you can do with an English major, and I think that there's room for those conversations, I think it's important to just also know that reading for enjoyment and learning for enjoyment is very valuable. And I think people can be encouraged in that more. It's like not everything you do has to have some sort of productive value to it. So yeah, I guess my hope is that people are shifting more towards that because there's such a heavy emphasis on productivity in our society.
And it's the reason everybody has tremendous burnout. Like
Yes,
the bubble,
yeah.
I think that people are saying the bubble's going to burst. It's like, I think that it already is bursting. That's why we
Yeah.
have such a mental health epidemic in this country. Like we're all so burned out. We're so stressed.
Exactly.
And it's because capitalism has been just grinding us into bits and we can't do it anymore.
Yeah. I think people are looking for things that are you just do them because they enrich your life. I've noticed a lot of girls my age are knitting a lot and baking a lot, and they're also doing other amazing things, but I think we're returning back to the idea of just having hobbies for enjoyment, that you don't have to start an Etsy shop. You can if you want to, but you can also just make things and share them amongst each other. So I think that that's hopeful for the humanities, because that's what I think the study of the humanities should do, is to make us more human.
What's the best book that you've read recently?
That's a tough one. I don't know if I can say the best book I've read recently, but I guess the book I'm reading right now is Old God's Time by Sebastian Barry. And I just started it recently, but so far it's really good. And I've never read this author before, but I'm loving it. It's about a retired Irish detective. So I'm excited to keep reading it.
Rachel Williamson, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. This was super fun.
Relevate is produced each week by Audacious Media and the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Today's episode was hosted, produced, and edited by myself, Daniel Charles Wright, and executive produced by Dr. Megan Sweeney. Special thanks to Randall Library and the excellent people at the Digital Makerspace for lending us their studio. If you have a project, a paper, or a topic that you'd like to discuss on the podcast, and you're a faculty member or a student of an accredited college or university, please send us an email at relevatepod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.